Okay, so this will be the first module for Chapter 7 on external economies. And so this first module really will have the role of trying to put this chapter into the context of the course in general. Okay, so you've already spent 7 sessions with me and with Justin looking at international trades. And so the reason why we indicated that understanding international trade is important is because there is a lot of evidence that those countries that trade more tend to grow faster as well. And so you can see this in this graph that I've also shown last session, which simply demonstrate that if you correlate on the x-axis the average growth in real GDP per capita, and on the y-axis the average growth in the share of exports to GDP, what you actually find out is that it is positively correlated, which simply means that those countries that trade more or see more growth in their trade tend to also grow faster as well. And this is really why policymakers around the world care about international trade. Now, we've already started looking at what might explain international trade. And so we spent 7 weeks on this. And so what I want to really hammer in to you in this first module is that up to now you've only seen certain explanations of certain types of trades. But there's still a lot that has not been explained. Okay, so you spent a lot of time on the Heckscher-Ohlin model, which is really the key model that people use to explain international trade. But it's important that that this model only explains a certain type of trade, which is trades between different countries that is inter-industry of nature. Okay, and I'll explain a bit more what I mean with it. So if you go back to the Heckscher-Ohlin model, the basic assumptions that you had in the model was that you had two countries that were identical in every respect, except that they had different relative factor abundances. Okay, so one country had relatively more labor. This was a labor abundant country, and the other country had relatively more capital, and so this was a capital abundant country. And then what you assumed was that there also were two industries that had different relative factor requirements. One was a labor intensive industry because they needed relatively more labor, and the other industry was more capital intensive. Okay, and so what you saw in this model is that if these countries do not trade with each other, then what you will find out is that because one country is more abundant in labor, as a result of that, in that country, the labor intensive product is relatively cheaper than in the other country, but the capital intensive product is relatively more expensive. Okay, so we saw that before trade, really there were differences in prices between the countries, and that really led to the reason why countries started to trade. So after trade, what started happening is that the labor abundant country, which had a comparative advantage in the labor intensive product, started exporting the labor intensive product, and the capital abundant country started exporting the capital intensive products. Okay, so what you had here was an explanation for trade between two very different countries because the difference was what drove trade. And the type of trade that you see happening is what we call inter-industry trade because one country exports in one industry and another country exports in the other industry. Okay, so I already demonstrated this graph last time as well. So this simply gives some evidence that the Heckscher-Ohlin model works in certain circumstances. So what we're looking at here is imports into the United States from Japan and Bangladesh. And so on the x-axis, you show all the industries ordered by skill intensity, where the most to the left, you have the least skill intensive industries like textiles, and the most to the right, you've got the most skill intensive industries, which are probably high technology industries. And on the y-axis, you have the share of US imports from Japan and Bangladesh. And what this model shows, very much in line with Heckscher-Ohlin, is that Bangladesh, which is a labor abundant country, has a relatively higher share in industry to the left, which are these labor intensive industries. But then it kind of goes down the share as you go to the more skill intensive industries. And you see the opposite pattern for Japan. So this is really Heckscher-Ohlin in action. Okay. So after we saw the Heckscher-Ohlin model, we then last lecture started looking at a different type of model which tried to explain a different type of trade. So here I'm just showing you the matrix of trade models. I'm showing you here the Heckscher-Ohlin model, which explains different countries trading inter-industry. And we're going to see that actually different models will be explaining other types of trade as well. Okay. So what we indicated was that one of the problems with the Heckscher-Ohlin model is that it cannot explain the rise of global value chains. Okay, so in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, the only type of trade you should be seeing is trade in final goods, where one country produces one good entirely and the other country produces the other good entirely, and they start trading. In reality, what we're seeing is that you also have a lot of trade in intermediate goods. And so Topper, the Tricteria here, which I presented last time as well, really demonstrates the importance of intermediate good trade, because in order to make this one very simple product, you have many different countries involved in the production process that are located in many different locations. And so given that the plastic eyes are made in Shenzhen, these plastic eyes will have to be eventually exported to another country in order to be put together with the plastic body that's made in Malaysia, with the microfiber fabric for coat that's made in Korea, etc., etc. Okay, so we need to have a model that not only explains trade in final goods, we need a model that can explain trade in intermediate goods as well within the same industry. Okay. Here's another indication why this is really important to be able to do, because if you look at US imports, what you actually find out is that more than half of US imports is actually intermediate goods. And intermediate goods are the green part, but also capital goods, which is also a type of intermediate goods. So ultimately, trade in final goods, if we can explain that, we only explain about half of global trade. Okay, so what we did was we again built a very simple model that had a lot of similar characteristics to the Heckscher-Ohlin model, okay, but also some very important differences. So the first similarity is that we assumed that countries only differ in their relative factor abundances, so that you've got one labor abundant country and one capital abundant country. Okay, but now what we assumed last time is that in order to produce one single good, you actually need to have two tasks that have to be completed. Okay, you need to have first a capital intensive input being made. For a computer, it might be a semiconductor. And then secondly, once this input has been made, you have to put this input into a final good through manufacturing. And we're going to assume that manufacturing is more labor intensive in nature. Okay, so what we have here, which is very different from the Heckscher-Ohlin model, is we're not going to assume that there are two goods that are being traded. We're going to assume there's one good, but two activities that are required to be done to make one good. And for very simplistic reasons, we're going to assume that the final good is only going to be consumed in the capital abundant country, so in the developed country. Okay. So in this kind of a model, what you're going to get is that before trade, ultimately, there won't be any trade, and all production will take place in the capital abundant countries. So the capital abundant country is first going to make the capital intensive inputs, and then once the capital intensive input has been done, it's going to be using the labor intensive production process in order to manufacture it into a final good. Okay, and so there's no real trade going on. Assume now that suddenly you see trade opening up, and assume that transportation costs, etc., are not too big. then what we're going to see is that the capital intensive input will still be produced in the capital abundant country because that is a country that has a comparative advantage in that task. They are going to export this capital intensive input to the labor abundant country where the labor intensive manufacturing process takes place. And then what we're going to see is that the final goods after manufacturing will be exported back to the capital abundant country. So we do see trade going on in both directions, but what we actually see is that the trade that is going on is not between industries, but it is going on within the same industry. So within the same industry, you will see the input being exported from the capital abundant country to the labor abundant country, and you see the final good being exported from the labor abundant country to the capital abundant country. So what you get then is intra-industry trade, trade within the same industry between different countries. Okay, so we can actually put this into the matrix of trade models where we now have a second trade model that explains trade between different countries. The first one, the Hector-Alin model, explained inter-industry trade, whereas the second model explained intra-industry trade. The only problem with these two models is that the more that the relative factor endowments become the same between the countries, both in the Hector-Alin model and in the global value chain model, what you're going to see is that there is going to be less and less trade between the countries. So in the models that we've presented up to now, what we're going to find out is that once countries become identical, there is no reason anymore why they should be trading. And this is problematic because if you look at which countries really trade with each other, if you look especially in the 19th century, but even all the way to 1950, what you're actually finding out is that more than 50% of trade at that time was between rich countries. Canada exports a lot with the United States. The United States exports a lot with the European Union. European Union trades a lot with Japan, etc., etc. Most trade right now still is, or a lot of trade right now still, really is between developed countries, and none of the models that we have seen up to now can explain why this is the case. So what this means is that Chapter 7 is really going to be about trying to find initial reasons why there might be trade between similar countries. In order to do this, we are going to bring in increasing returns to scale into international trade models. Okay? We're going to make a distinction between internal scale economies and external scale economies. In fact, Chapter 7 will be about external scale economies, and Chapter 8 will be about internal scale economies. And as we're going to explain the sources of external economies, we're going to find out that knowledge spillovers matter a lot. So knowledge, which is something that developed countries are really strong at, is going to be a key feature in the models we'll be presenting in Chapter 7. Okay, so this is the end of the first module. In the second module, we'll start delving into scale economies, but I'll also start giving you some exercises from the end of the chapter that you can start doing. So this can be kind of one way that we can make this course a bit more dynamic. Okay, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you soon.